The seventh Sunday after Trinity, Lord of all power and might, who art the author and giver of all good things, graft in our hearts the love of thy name. Increase in us true religion. Nourish us with all goodness. And of thy great mercy, keep us in the same through our Lord Jesus Christ. Amen. Verse 3 of hymn 596. Crown, O God, thine own endeavor, this with thy sword. Feed all those who do not know thee with the richness of thy word. Cleanse the body of this nation through the glory of thy Lord. We begin our work with Professor John Bright. The prologue, the ancient Orient before 2000 BC. Approximately, it's got some wonderful maps at the back. It's about 480 pages or so. As the Bible presents it, the history of Israel began with the migration of the Hebrew patriarchs from Mesopotamia to their new homeland in Palestine. This was indeed the beginning, if not of Israel's history, properly speaking, then at least of her prehistory. For it was with that migration that her ancestors first stepped onto the stage. Since this took place, as we shall see, at some time during the first half of the second millennium BC, it is there that our story properly takes its start. Yet to begin with 2000 BC, as though nothing happened before that time, would be unwise. The Bible suggests, and recent discoveries have made clear, that much indeed had happened. Though it is no part of our subject, and we are forbidden for what reason to go into detail, it would be well first to say a few words about the course of human history prior to that time. This will enable us both to set the stage for our story and to gain the needed perspective, thereby guarding ourselves, it is hoped, against wrong notions concerning the age of Israel's origins. To us who live in this late day, the second millennium BC seems like a very long time ago. We are tempted to think of it as lying near the dawn of time, when man's struggle upwards from savagery into the light of history, and are prone, therefore, to underestimate its cultural achievements. We are further prone to picture Hebrew ancestors, tent-dwelling wanderers, that they were, as the most primitive of nomads, cut off from the mode of life, from the contact with what culture there was, whose religion was the crudest sort of animism or polydaimonism. So in fact, did many of the older handbooks depict them. This, however, is an erroneous notion and a symptom of the want of perspective, a carryover from the days when little was known at first hand of the ancient Orient. It is necessary, therefore, to throw the picture into focus. Horizons have widened amazingly in the past generation. Whatever one says of Israel's origins must be said with a full awareness that these lie nowhere near the dawn of history. The earliest decipherable inscriptions in Egypt and Mesopotamia reach back to the early centuries of the third millennium BC, thus approximately 1,000 years before Abraham, 1,500 years before Moses. Their history, properly speaking, begins. Moreover, in the course of the last few decades, discoveries in all parts of the Bible world and beyond have revealed a succession of yet earlier cultures, which reach back through the fourth millennium, the fifth and the sixth, to the seventh, and in some instances, farther still. The Hebrews were in fact latecomers onto the history stage. All across the Bible, lands, cultures had come to birth, assumed classical form, and run their course for hundreds of years before Abraham was born. Difficult as it is for us to realize, it is actually farther in time from the beginnings of civilization in the Near East to the age of Israel's origins and it is from that later age to our own. Before history, the foundations of civilization in the ancient Orient, earliest Stone Age settlements. The earliest permanent villages known to us made their appearance toward the end of the Stone Age, as far back as the 7th century millennium. Before that, men lived in caves. The transition to settled life. The story of Stone Age is not our concern. Suffice it to say that from the terraces of the Nile Valley to the highlands of northern Iraq, characteristic attest to the presence of man as early as the Old Stone Age. The succeeding Middle Paleolithic witnessed skeletal remains, and the Late Paleolithic found men in long cave-dwelling stage. He lived entirely by hunting and foraging. It was only as the last ice age ended, approximately in the 9th millennium BC, and he's using a word like approximately, rather loosely here, and the rigors of climate abated, man was able, and again, how does he know that? Man was able to take the first steps toward a food-producing economy. Of course, they were food-producing economy. You had to live off animals and herbs. He learned that wild grains could be cultivated and animals herded for food. It's all the way back to Adam and Eve. This transition, another word he uses liberally, the Natufan culture of Palestine, so-called from the caves of Wadi al-Natuf, is an illustration of it. Here we see man living in caves, but having also begun to establish crude settlements for seasonal occupation. The earliest settlement at Jericho belongs to this period and was in existence by 8000 BC. Radiocarbon dates plus or minus 7892 have been given for newly found Jericho. But Miss Watson correctly remarks these dates are to be used with the greatest of caution. Okay, although Natufian man lived chiefly by hunting, foraging, and fishing, we still live that way. It's the farmers who feed us, the farmers who raise the animals and do the fishermen who do the fishing. We still do the same thing they did back then. The presence of flint sickles and other implements indicate that they had learned to harvest wild grain and perhaps grow cereal crops in a limited way. The domestication of certain animals seems to have begun. Similar developments are witnessed elsewhere, notably in the highlands of northern Iraq, where the caves of Zarzi and Palagra show us that man, at the end of his purely food-gathering stage, what's that mean? We're still in the food-gathering stage. I live in a land of farmers. Cows over here, corn over there, chickens back there. He talks like an urbanized, industrialized professor of Old Testament sitting in his library. People just do not understand the role farmers play today. Alas, but it was the Neolithic period that the transition from cave dwelling to sedentary life, from food gathering to food producing economy. That's just sheer theory. Again, Neolithic Jericho, Catherine Kenyon, the oldest known permanent settlements, far most interesting to the students of the Bible, is that found in the lower levels of the mound of Jericho. As we have said, Jericho was settled at least as far back as 8000 BC. But for many centuries, little stood there save huts. which may represent no more than a long series of settlements. These were ultimately succeeded, however, by a permanent town which continued through many levels of building in two distinct phases, perhaps representing two successful populations, which reveals a Neolithic culture before the invention of pottery. From the extreme depth of its remains, up to 45 feet, it is evident that this culture endured for centuries. It seems to have been at the beginning of the end of the 8th millennium BC and lasted well down into the 6th BC. It's got radiocarbon tests to be made, yielded dates of 7th, 6th millennium by Kenyon. Subsequent texts have yielded much higher dates, or what was meant with the early ones, and dates which were much lower. In view of the wide variation, caution is in order. Oh my. We're so cautious with historians and exegetes. You just have to be. So they have floors, walls, paintings, reed mats, small clay figurines of women, unique statues of clay on weed frames. And equally interesting are groups of human skulls. The bad bodies were buried elsewhere, as a rule under house floors, with features modeled in clay and with shells for eyes. These undoubtedly serve some cultic purpose. Certainly attest to marked artistic ability. Bones of dogs, goats, pigs, sheep, and oxen indicate animals were domesticated, while sickles, querns, and grinders attest to the cereal crops. And this is more than 5,000 years before Abraham. Other Neolithic cultures. Remarkable as Neolithic Jericho is, it can no longer be thought of as standing in lonely isolation. For recent discoveries have made it clear that permanent villages were being established all over the Bible world, as back to the 7th. And yet a footnote says 4000 BC, which is 2 millennium before Abraham. In Mesopotamian lands, the transition to agrarian life is best illustrated at the lower levels of the Mount of Jarmo in the highlands of northern Iraq. Houses crudely built with packed. Radiocarbon tests indicated that pre-pottery levels are quite old, as old as the ones at Jericho. The Mediterranean coast likewise indicate earliest settlement at Rosh Shamra, again without pottery, reaches back to the 7th millennium. Palestine, too, pre-pottery Neolithic, is placed in the 7th. Hakalar and Capital Hayuk in an area usually thought of as a cultural backwater. That's not true either. It's not a cultural backwater. The Hittite culture was pretty sophisticated in and around the time of Moses. The latter of these sites is the largest Neolithic settlement so far as known, and nearly several times the size of Jericho and economically more advanced. Village life continued to develop through the 6th millennium and into the 5th, by which villages and towns had been established almost everywhere. In the course of this time, pottery had generally been introduced. Villages in which pottery was known were in existence at varied places on the Mediterranean coast. Rosh Shamra, Byblos, and Cilicia. Northern Syria, Mersin, Tel, Judea, and Cyprus, and in Anatolia. In Mesopotamia, there flourished the Hassuna culture, so called after the site near Mosul was first identified. but found at various places in the upper Tigris region. Meanwhile, sedentary life had also begun in Egypt. I don't know how do you engage sedentary life? People sit in chairs all day long, like me. Traces of the presence of man in Egypt go back to the early Paleolithic age, when the Nile Delta lay under the sea and its valley was a swampy jungle inhabited by wild animals. We may assume that men had lived on the fringes of the valley ever since and made their way in to fish and hunt, and subsequently to settle down. Cultural developments in Mesopotamia, the introduction of metal, the Neolithic age ends, the so-called Chalcolithic Copper Stone Age begins. Precisely when this tradition may be said to have taken place is a disputed subject which cannot detain us. But in Mesopotamia, the whole period is attested to by a series of cultures called after the sites where they were first identified. A few significant gaps down through the 5th millennium to the 4th, to the threshold of history in the 3rd. It was a period of amazing cultural flowering. Agriculture vastly improved and expanded. I don't believe that. It's just assurance. I mean, Adam and Eve living off the herbs and animals since time immemorial. He's just a little bit too in awe here. It's intruding on his historical narrative. Most of the cities were founded that were to play a part in Mesopotamian history for millenniums to come. Drainage and irrigation projects were undertaken, and as these became more elaborate, required continual maintenance and regulation. As commerce and economic life developed, like you said, they were sedentary. The earliest people were somewhere. By the end of the 4th millennium, in fact, Mesopotamian civilization had assumed all the essentials that would characterize it for thousands to come. He's really throwing around big terms here. Where's John from? I think he's Presbyterian somewhere. To check that. Early painted pottery cultures, cultural flowering, he likes that word, began in the upper Mesopotamia, while the lower river valleys were still marshaling without settled population. Already in the 6th millennium, there emerged the Hasuna culture, previously mentioned. This was a village culture based on small farming, but with increased craft specialization. While metal was still unknown, certain types of painted pottery had begun to appear, especially handsome as the so-called Samara-ware pottery, decorated with monochrome, geometric animal and human figures of great artistic excellence. By this time, the river valleys of the upper Mesopotamia were rather densely settled. Villages were, by the standard of the day, well built, with rectangular houses of pounded earth or crude brick, like today, made of brick. Only we've got industrialization for it, because we're so much more advanced than those backwoodsmen. More massive circular structures were low, domed roofs served a purpose, the nature of which is unknown. Numerous clay figurines of animals and of women, the latter often in the position of childbirth, argue that the cult of the mother goddess was practiced. Especially noteworthy, however, is the magnificent pottery. Kiln-fired but handmade without the use of a wheel, it is characterized by polychrome, geometric, and floral designs of an artistic excellence and beauty seldom equaled since. Let's see, let's get a little dreary here. We'll get some more time to go. The sequence of pre-dynastic cultures in lower Mesopotamia. What I like this stuff. Don't get me wrong. What I don't like is the historical intrusiveness of commentary. I just distrust historians. It's my training. He's using some big words here. It was, however, by the way, this is the second edition. There's a third and a fourth, and I don't have the more recent ones. I think Professor G.E. Wright was involved in some of the subsequent work. It was, however, in the latter part of the fourth millennium that the cultural flowering of Mesopotamia reached its climax. The settlement of Lower Mesopotamia, the founding of great cities there, and the organization of the first city-states opened the way for an amazing cultural and technical advance. Oh, we like that word, advance. A series of cultures in Lower Mesopotamia carries us down to the light of history in the third. Conventionally, these are known in descending order. The Obeid, 4000 to 3500, Wakara down to the 23rd century, and Jemdet Nasser, 31st to the 29th century. After the cities where they were built respectively, the Warka culture at approximately the time of the age, he puts it 3300 BC. Wow. And to bracket the latter part, or the proto-literate, footnote 10. Both the point at which the division should be made and the name for the new period thus is disputed. Civilization thus got its start in Lower Mesopotamia rather late, after it had already run its course for many of hundreds of years in the upper part of the valley. The reasons are easy to see. Lower Mesopotamia has in general insufficient rainfall to support a viable culture and must depend for its water upon the great rivers that flow through it toward the Persian Gulf. But these are subject to periodic flooding. Since they were uncontrolled, they not infrequently changed their courses and spread their sluggish waters over the flat terrain to form vast marshes and lagoons where nothing useful could grow. True then and true now still, unless it's near the river. Hot, blasting, searing sun and winds of southern Iraq. And this was certainly not done in a day. There's dikes and canals now. The labor of draining and preparing the land and establishing cities must have expanded over centuries. I thought he said earlier that there was settling down was sedentary in advance. These people were hardworking. The word sedentary and energetic and active. There's a whole river traffic up and down developed on Tigris-Euphrates River. On the other hand, the extraordinarily rich bottomland began to be exploited. We may assume the population increased at a steady pace. The proto-literate period. The next phase, the Warka, was probably brief. Whether it developed out of the Obeid or was brought by newcomers from outside is again a question that cannot detain us. The ensuing proto-literate period, 33rd to the 29th century BCs, however, brought a burst of progress like few in world history. This was a period of great urban development, in the course of which Mesopotamian civilization was given normative form. A system of dikes and canals which made intensive cultivation of the alluvial plain possible was by this time fully developed. Population increased apace, and great cities sprang up everywhere. City-states, they did not already exist, were developed. Mud brick temples built on platforms above the level of floodwaters, of which the great temple complex in Erech is a shining example. Exhibit features characteristic of Mesopotamian temple architecture, through all the centuries to come. Elsewhere, new techniques are in evidence. The wheel and the ovens for firing pottery were in use, making possible aware of technical excellence. But no forward step was more epoch-making than the invention of writing. The earliest texts known to us anywhere come from the closing centuries of the fourth millennium, which when we get down to Moses, we act like we're surprised because he was a writer. I remember being told, forget where it was, that they didn't have writing in Moses' time. He shared results of scientific criticism. Give me a break. Alas, well, it looks like we're running out of time here. It's sort of the end of the day. This is a big deal. Writing. We're on to a new hymn here, 597. Brother, it's a 20th century thing, so we'll just watch. O day of peace that dimly shines through all our hopes and prayers and dreams, guide us to justice, truth, and love, delivered from our selfish schemes. Our hearts from envy find release, till by God's grace our wayfaring world shall see Christ's promised reign of grace. This is no going nowhere. Reintroduce the Psalter, please. Never use that again. Cross out. Revelation 5:13. Blessing and honor and glory, power be unto him that sitteth upon the throne, unto the Lamb forever and ever. Godspeed.